Since over 200 different cultures wrote about a flood, then that means Noah's flood is real, that God flooded the whole entire world. And scientists have proven that the world was once covered by water 3 to 4 billion years ago. This is the argument that I've received most recently based by a lot of Christians or Bible believers. I'm going to show you how Christians have to go through such mental gymnastics in order to facilitate their Bible to be true. And at the end of the day, all it really shows is that they have confirmation bias. The first part, the most boring part, is the fact that they are claiming that now, since an Australian study as well as a Harvard study has demonstrated that it is possible that the earth was covered by water up to 70 to 90% 3 to 4 billion years ago, that is proof that the world was once covered by water, whether we are looking at it from the aspect of Genesis chapter 1, when the world was supposedly covered by water, or we're talking about Noah's flood. They try to utilize that. Now, if they actually read the studies, they would see that at no point in time does either study say that the world was completely covered by water. They're saying that it's possible, that if, that maybe, and all these other sorts of word choices that they utilize to be able to say that we don't know the exact amount, but we are not actually saying that it was completely covered by water. So there is still the fact that the earth has never been fully covered by water. Second part is that they have not had peer review to see whether or not these findings are correct and if their math actually is doing some mathing. So those studies are still just theories that have not been proven and have not went through peer review. Plus, these things would have happened 3 to 4 billion years ago, which we know the earth, according to biblical timeline, was only created around 6,600 years ago. So that negates the entire aspect of what you're saying. Now, as far as going to Noah's flood, this is the more interesting part. They claim that over 200 societies have had flood narratives. And since these societies have a flood narrative, then that makes the Noah story correct. Not necessarily. And we're only going to focus on one of those stories, because this is where the mental gymnastics that they are unwilling to think about, and most people who deconstruct hasn't really thought about this either. So let's walk through this line. According to the Sumerians, you have the flood story of Gilgamesh, where and you can find this in the Flood of Gilgamesh or the Epic of Gilgamesh. You can find this in the Atrahasis, where it talks about how, very similar to the Noah flood, that the god Enlil wanted mankind to be destroyed because he knew that this flood was coming. So he was going to allow all the humans to die. Enki, liking humans to a certain degree, wanted some of his creation to survive. Enki had a baby with Lamech's wife, which made him his son. So he looked like one of the shining ones, is what it says, the gods. So, but Methuselah told Lamech, raise him as your own kid. Since Noah / Atrahasis / Utnapishtim, if you want to use the other name, was half Anunnaki, he was allowed to survive once Enlil realized that he had survived by building a boat and having the seed of everything on the planet on that boat. Now, this story of the Epic of Gilgamesh is told about 3,000 years prior to a Hebrew, an Israelite, ever being mentioned or coming into existence. This story is told before Abraham comes into existence. This story is told before any story of Noah ever came into existence. The mental gymnastics that a believer of this book would have to make is to say that those people, the Sumerians, were merely telling a story that the Israelite people had been telling verbally but hadn't written it down for all this time. Now, let's walk through this a little bit more. In order for this to be, that would mean that the Sumerians created writing that the Israelites did not create. They didn't create their own writings, had no writings. So, therefore, while the Sumerians were writing their story, the Israelites were not writing their story down, because we have the Sumerian tablets. Many of them were found at Nineveh, but we don't have any tablets, any writings that predate the Sumerian writings from the Hebrew Israelite people. So we have to make the mental gymnastics that they were telling the story while the other group was writing the story. The next mental gymnastics that we have to make. We know that Noah had, according to the story, 3 sons. And out of his 3 sons, Shem would have been the one that would have created the Sumerian people, according to people who forced this narrative to fit into their history. Although the Noah story happened around 2200 BCE, according to the biblical timeline, the Sumerians were walking around in around 7000 BCE, 6000 BCE. So we have a full 4,000 to 5,000 years that the Sumerians will walk around. So they have to make that mental leap and say that no, those Sumerians could not have been walking around at that time frame, because they have to be the children of Shem. Now the other mental leap that you have to make. Shem, who maybe didn't believe his father Noah at first, but then eventually believed him, got on the boat, saw the flood happen, spent the whole year and some change on the boat, got off the boat, saw the sacrifice, saw God come down and talk to his daddy and tell him what had happened, and talk to him and put the rainbow in the sky and do the offering and all these things. Shem and Shem's children then decided on their own that when they dispersed, that instead of telling the story the exact same way that they had witnessed it from their father, and that they had witnessed from their grandfather, and so on and so forth, change the story to say that it is the Anunnaki, that it is Enlil and Enki and it's Ilnana and Dumuzi and Harsag and Anu, that they completely went away from what they witnessed as what Yahweh, Jehovah had done, what Elion or El had done, and just completely wrote a brand new story and incorporated Gilgamesh and Atrahasis and Utnapishtim and all these other deities into their story, so that there can be confusion, so that people wouldn't know the same story. And maybe some of the people who are going to come after this video will say that, well, initially they all taught the same story, and then when God mixed up the languages at the Tower of Babel, then they went off and that's when they created their own story. But the Tower of Babel supposedly happens a few hundred years after the Noah's flood, which would mean that it happened in or around 1900, 1800 BCE. But we have proof of evidence that the Sumerians were 6,000, 7,000 BCE. So how do you get there? Mental gymnastics, cognitive dissonance, confirmation bias. That's how you get there. Simply because other people have flood stories does not make the Noah story true. If that's the case, why can't the Gilgamesh story be the true story? Why can't the people of Singapore story be the true story? The Inca story be the true story? Should not their story count and have just as much weight as your Bible story? Or is it purely because you believe in your Bible and that is what's going to make it be correct because of your mental gymnastics? Tell me what you think. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you're finding value in these videos. And always remember, you have to free yourself to be yourself, because your greatness is non-negotiable. Good journey, good vibrations.